You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your educational journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. Third-party risk management is the discipline of evaluating and overseeing vendors, partners, and sub-processors whose services affect cloud security and compliance. Modern organizations rarely operate alone. They depend on an extended ecosystem of providers for infrastructure, applications, analytics, and support. Each relationship expands the potential attack surface and introduces obligations that cannot be ignored. The purpose of third-party risk management is to ensure these relationships remain transparent, controlled, and aligned with organizational risk appetite. Without such oversight, organizations may inherit vulnerabilities or compliance gaps from partners, only discovering them during incidents or audits. Effective third-party risk management combines structured due diligence at onboarding with continuous monitoring throughout the lifecycle. It treats vendors not as black boxes, but as integral components of the security program. This framework transforms uncertainty into accountability, giving leaders confidence that provider dependencies remain within acceptable boundaries. Third-party risk itself is the potential for harm that arises when external entities handle data, connect systems, or provide critical services. Risks may include data breaches at a vendor, operational failures due to financial instability, or compliance penalties if sub-processors mishandle regulated data. For example, a cloud storage provider suffering a misconfiguration can expose sensitive information, even if the customer maintained strong internal controls. This demonstrates the shared responsibility model. Security outcomes depend not only on internal practices but also on the posture of third parties. Third-party risk is like lending your car to a friend. You may maintain insurance and brakes, but their driving habits still affect your safety. Recognizing these risks as systemic rather than isolated is the first step toward managing them. Organizations must treat external providers as extensions of their own risk landscape, with accountability embedded into governance structures. Vendor inventory is the foundation of third-party risk management. It is a current, detailed list of all providers, the services they deliver, the data they handle, and the regions where they operate. Each vendor entry typically identifies an internal owner accountable for oversight, ensuring no provider falls into a governance blind spot. In cloud, inventories can grow quickly as teams adopt new tools or services without centralized visibility, leading to shadow IT. An accurate inventory is like a map for navigation. Without it, organizations cannot steer or respond effectively during disruption. Inventories also support prioritization, allowing high-risk providers to receive more scrutiny. They must be updated regularly, often through automated discovery integrated with procurement and identity systems. A static inventory is of little value. Only living, continuously updated records provide the situational awareness necessary to manage third-party dependencies responsibly. Criticality tiers classify vendors based on their impact to business operations, data sensitivity, and dependency levels. Not all providers pose equal risk. A marketing SaaS tool may be less critical than a payment processor or core cloud infrastructure service. Tiering allows organizations to allocate resources efficiently, applying rigorous assessments to high-impact vendors while streamlining oversight for low-risk ones. For example, Tier 1 providers may require full audits and continuous monitoring, while Tier 3 providers receive periodic reviews. This approach is like triage in emergency medicine. Resources are directed where stakes are highest. Without criticality tiers, organizations risk spreading attention too thin or overlooking crucial providers. Tiering also provides a defensible framework during audits, showing regulators that oversight is risk-based and proportionate. Classification ensures third-party risk management remains practical, scalable, and aligned with business priorities. Security questionnaires are common tools for gathering information about a vendor's control posture. These structured queries often cover topics like encryption, identity management, incident response, and compliance certifications. Questionnaires provide baseline visibility into provider practices and help compare vendors against internal policies. For example, an organization may ask whether a vendor enforces multi-factor authentication or maintains SOC 2 certification. While valuable, questionnaires are limited. They rely on vendor self-reporting and may not reveal actual practices. They are like resumes in hiring, informative but requiring validation. Effective programs pair questionnaires with follow-up evidence, such as attestation reports or technical testing. Used properly, questionnaires support consistency, ensure important topics are addressed, and build a foundation for trust. Alone, however, they are insufficient, reminding organizations that due diligence requires layered approaches rather than reliance on self-declared claims. Independent assurance strengthens vendor evaluation by leveraging third-party reports and certifications. Common examples include society reports, ISO 27001 certifications, and sector-specific attestations like PCI-DSS. These independent assessments provide evidence that controls are not only designed but also tested by qualified auditors. For example, a Society 2 Type 2 report demonstrates that a provider's security controls were effective over time, not just on paper. Independent assurance is like requiring an inspector's certification for a building. It proves compliance to standards beyond self-assertions. However, organizations must read these reports critically, paying attention to scope, exceptions, and user entity control considerations. Not all certifications are equal, and some may omit critical services. Independent assurance complements questionnaires, reducing reliance on vendor claims and providing defensible evidence for regulators and auditors. It transforms trust into verifiable confidence, reinforcing shared responsibility in third-party governance. The Cloud Security Alliance, or CSA, provides cloud-focused tools for vendor evaluation, including the Consensus Assessments Initiative Questionnaire, or CAIQ. This structured questionnaire covers control domains specific to cloud, such as virtualization, multi-tenancy, and shared responsibility. It aligns with the CSA's Cloud Controls Matrix, enabling organizations to compare provider practices across multiple frameworks. Vendors can also publish responses in the CSA's STAR registry, increasing transparency. The CAIQ is like a standardized exam. Providers answer the same questions, allowing customers to benchmark responses. For organizations, using CSA tools ensures cloud-specific risks are considered rather than relying solely on generic IT questionnaires. While still self-reported, CAIQ provides a common language for discussing cloud security. Paired with independent attestations, it forms a solid foundation for third-party due diligence, ensuring cloud risks receive the specialized attention they require. Technical testing validates provider claims by directly reviewing configurations, interfaces, and potential exposures. This may involve safe penetration testing, vulnerability scans, or controlled exercises within agreed scopes. For example, a customer may validate that APIs require authentication, or that storage buckets are not publicly exposed. Technical testing is like inspecting a house before purchase. Disclosures from the seller are important, but verification provides assurance. In cloud, technical testing must respect provider boundaries and permissions, often requiring coordination through support channels or contractual agreements. Unauthorized testing may violate acceptable use policies, so governance is essential. When permitted, technical testing offers powerful validation, catching gaps between stated policies and operational reality. It complements documentation and certifications, ensuring organizations rely on evidence of performance rather than only promises. Privacy due diligence evaluates how vendors handle personal data in compliance with laws like GDPR, CCPA, or HIPAA. This includes confirming roles of controller and processor, lawful bases for processing, and mechanisms for honoring data subject rights. For example, due diligence may confirm whether a provider supports data subject access requests or complies with cross-border transfer requirements. Privacy due diligence is like checking food labels for allergens. It ensures data is handled responsibly and transparently. Without it, organizations risk regulatory penalties or reputational harm for vendor missteps. In cloud, privacy due diligence often overlaps with security reviews but requires specialized legal and compliance input. By systematically evaluating privacy practices, organizations ensure external providers align with internal commitments and regulatory obligations. This step transforms abstract privacy principles into concrete vendor accountability. Data processing agreements, or DPAs, are critical contracts that define processing purposes, security safeguards, and rights for approving subprocessors. They formalize the controller-processor relationship, ensuring providers act only on customer instructions. For example, a DPA may require breach notifications within 72 hours and mandate encryption for all stored data. DPAs also provide transparency into subcontractors and demand customer approval for changes. In practice, they are like service manuals. They spell out responsibilities, procedures, and limits for handling sensitive assets. Without DPAs, organizations cannot prove compliance with privacy regulations, leaving them vulnerable to fines and disputes. DPAs complement technical safeguards, providing legal defensibility and clarity in governance. By embedding DPAs into vendor contracts, organizations ensure personal data is protected consistently across the supply chain. Contractual clauses extend beyond DPAs to include breach notifications, audit rights, and cooperation commitments. These terms ensure vendors support investigations, share evidence, and allow customers to validate compliance. For example, audit clauses may grant access to SOC reports or permit on-site inspections under defined conditions. Breach notification clauses require prompt reporting of incidents, enabling customers to meet their own legal obligations. Cooperation commitments establish expectations for joint response during cross-tenant events. These provisions are like fire codes in buildings. They may not prevent incidents, but they define how everyone must act when emergencies occur. Without strong clauses, customers risk being blindsided during crises. By negotiating comprehensive terms, organizations strengthen third-party resilience, ensuring providers remain accountable during both routine operations and extraordinary events. Financial health and viability checks assess whether vendors are stable enough to provide services long-term. Even technically secure providers pose risks if they are financially unsound, as sudden insolvency can disrupt operations or trigger data loss. Evaluating financial reports, credit ratings, and funding history provides insight into sustainability. For smaller vendors, stability may hinge on single contracts or investors, increasing risk. Financial due diligence is like checking the foundation of a building. Strength above is meaningless if the base is weak. In cloud, viability matters because dependencies often extend to mission-critical services. Abrupt discontinuity can ripple across operations, leaving organizations scrambling for replacements. Proactive financial checks ensure vendors are not only capable today but also resilient tomorrow, aligning long-term risk management with operational reliability. Concentration risk analysis identifies when organizations over-rely on a small number of providers or shared services. For example, depending on a single cloud provider for all workloads increases exposure if that provider suffers an outage or compliance issue. Similarly, many vendors may rely on the same subprocessor, creating hidden dependencies. Concentration risk is like farming only one crop, efficient in the short term but vulnerable to disease or disaster. Analysis highlights where diversification is needed, whether through multi-cloud strategies, backup vendors, or redundancy planning. Without addressing concentration, organizations may inadvertently tie their resilience to a fragile ecosystem. By mapping dependencies and identifying choke points, concentration risk analysis provides visibility and informs strategic planning. It ensures provider reliance remains balanced and defensible, preventing single points of failure in critical services. Secure connectivity requirements ensure integrations with vendors are protected. Contracts and technical standards often mandate private links, encrypted channels, and federated identity for authentication. For instance, connecting to a payment processor may require dedicated VPN tunnels and single sign-on integration. Secure connectivity is like building a guarded highway between two cities. Only authorized vehicles may travel, and the path is protected from interception. Without defined requirements, vendor integrations may rely on insecure defaults, exposing sensitive data in transit. In cloud, where multiple services interconnect dynamically, enforcing secure connectivity prevents breaches and strengthens compliance. It also demonstrates diligence during audits, proving that vendor interactions are governed by structured safeguards. Secure connectivity requirements turn abstract trust into verifiable protections, ensuring third-party relationships remain safe, reliable, and defensible. Minimal access principles constrain vendor privileges to the least necessary for performing duties. Vendors should not retain broad administrative rights indefinitely. Instead, access must be scoped, monitored, and time-bound. For example, a support engineer may be granted temporary access for troubleshooting, with elevation logged and revoked after completion. This principle mirrors least privilege within organizations, extending it to third parties. It is like lending a key to a contractor for a day rather than giving them permanent access to your home. Continuous monitoring ensures vendors use only what is authorized. Without constraints, vendors can inadvertently or maliciously overstep, creating compliance risks. Minimal access demonstrates maturity, proving that organizations apply the same rigor to external accounts as to internal ones. By constraining privileges, they reduce the blast radius of third-party interactions, maintaining accountability. Onboarding controls finalize due diligence before a vendor begins production use. These controls verify that assessments, approvals, contracts, and baseline evidence are complete. For example, onboarding may require confirmation that a DPA is signed, SOC reports are reviewed, and access has been provisioned with least privilege. This is like a pre-flight checklist. No plane takes off until all systems are verified. Onboarding controls ensure vendors meet standards before handling sensitive data or workloads. Without them, organizations risk bypassing governance in the rush to innovate, introducing hidden vulnerabilities. Structured onboarding provides defensibility during audits, showing that providers entered the environment only after rigorous checks. It marks the transition from evaluation to trusted integration, reinforcing that third-party risk management is proactive, not reactive. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Continuous monitoring is the lifeblood of third-party risk management after onboarding. Providers may begin with strong assurances, but risks evolve as controls weaken, staff change, or new services are added. Continuous monitoring tracks posture changes, incidents, and attestation refresh dates on a defined cadence. For example, an organization might review society reports annually, check breach notification databases quarterly, and scan for certificate changes weekly. This is like regular medical checkups. Health at onboarding does not guarantee health later. Without monitoring, organizations rely on outdated assessments that fail to reflect reality. Continuous oversight demonstrates diligence, reassuring regulators and auditors that vendor governance is not a one-time exercise but an ongoing discipline. It ensures that trust in providers remains current and verifiable, keeping external dependencies aligned with organizational risk appetite and compliance obligations. External attack surface monitoring extends this oversight by observing exposed domains, certificates, and services linked to vendors. Even if providers attest to secure practices, misconfigurations may appear in public-facing systems. For instance, expired TLS certificates, exposed development subdomains, or misconfigured storage buckets may all signal weaknesses. Monitoring these exposures is like walking the perimeter of a fortress. Defenses must be observed, not only reported. Tools and threat intelligence platforms can automate scanning, correlating findings with vendor inventories. When issues arise, organizations can engage providers directly, validating responses and remediations. External monitoring adds independent visibility, reducing reliance on self-reported claims. By watching what vendors expose to the world, organizations gain a realistic picture of their risk, catching gaps between policy and practice before adversaries exploit them. Service-level agreements and key performance indicators formalize vendor expectations with measurable targets. SLAs may specify uptime percentages, response times, or resolution commitments. KPIs add operational metrics such as average incident response or ticket closure rates. Together, they turn abstract promises into quantifiable benchmarks. For example, a provider may guarantee 99.9% availability measured monthly with service credits for breaches. These agreements are like contracts with utility providers. Not only must service flow reliably, but remedies exist if commitments are missed. Monitoring SLA and KPI performance provides evidence of vendor reliability and accountability. Weak or absent agreements leave customers exposed, with little recourse during disruptions. By embedding SLAs and KPIs into governance, organizations create a feedback loop. Expectations are set, performance is measured, and gaps drive continuous improvement or escalation when providers underperform. Fourth-party risk recognizes that vendors often rely on their own providers, creating hidden dependencies. For example, a SaaS vendor may depend on a cloud infrastructure provider, who in turn relies on a content delivery network. If one fails, the effects cascade outward. Identifying and monitoring these critical sub-processors prevents blind spots. It is like knowing not just your direct suppliers but also their suppliers, ensuring resilience across the supply chain. Organizations can request disclosure of fourth-party relationships through contracts or assessments and evaluate whether these dependencies meet standards. Continuous monitoring may extend to these entities, especially for high-criticality services. Without fourth-party visibility, organizations may assume redundancy where none exists or underestimate concentration risk. Fourth-party oversight acknowledges that resilience is ecosystem-wide, not limited to direct vendor relationships, ensuring continuity even when hidden layers of dependency are exposed. Threat intelligence ingestion strengthens vendor oversight by correlating indicators with provider environments. If intelligence sources report vulnerabilities, breaches, or exploits affecting a vendor, organizations can cross-reference with their inventories. For instance, if a vendor's SSL certificate appears in breach data, security teams can investigate exposure. This is like weather alerts. External conditions inform how organizations prepare for storms. Threat intelligence makes vendor monitoring proactive rather than reactive, anticipating risks before they manifest. Integrating intelligence with detection platforms allows automated alerts when vendor identifiers appear in feeds. This supports timely engagement with providers, demanding remediation or clarification. Without intelligence, organizations rely solely on vendor disclosures, which may be delayed or incomplete. Ingesting threat intelligence closes this gap, creating a dynamic, externally informed layer of assurance for third-party risk programs. Vulnerability disclosure requirements define how vendors intake reports and how quickly they must remediate. Contracts may require public disclosure programs or defined remediation timelines. For example, vendors may be obligated to fix high-severity vulnerabilities within 30 days of discovery. These requirements are like recall policies in manufacturing. Flaws must be acknowledged, fixed, and communicated transparently. Without disclosure processes, vulnerabilities may linger unnoticed or unaddressed. Customers benefit from knowing vendors support responsible disclosure and treat findings seriously. Oversight includes reviewing bug bounty participation, disclosure policies, and historical responsiveness. By requiring structured intake and remediation, organizations ensure that vendor vulnerabilities do not become customer liabilities. These clauses embed accountability, aligning vendor operations with industry best practices for security responsiveness and transparency. Penetration testing coordination defines how vendors allow safe testing of their hosted assets. Some providers permit customer-driven tests under controlled scopes, while others require pre-approval or restrict activities to internal assessments. Clear rules prevent accidental violations of terms of service. For example, a customer may schedule penetration testing of a SaaS integration during defined maintenance windows with vendor cooperation. This is like fire drills in shared buildings. All tenants must coordinate to ensure safety without disruption. Contracts should specify permissions, scopes, and notification paths for penetration testing. Organizations benefit from the ability to validate claims and detect misconfigurations proactively. Without coordination, testing risks, damaging services, or creating liability. With it, penetration testing becomes a collaborative safeguard, reinforcing vendor security posture through structured, authorized evaluation. Incident integration predefines how organizations and vendors collaborate during cross-tenant events. These agreements specify contact paths, evidence requirements, and joint playbooks. For example, a provider may commit to notifying customers within 1 hour of detecting a breach, sharing logs and timelines as part of a coordinated investigation. Integration ensures responses are not improvised under stress but rehearsed and documented. It is like emergency drills involving multiple agencies. Coordination determines effectiveness. Without integration, incident response is fragmented, slowing containment and complicating regulatory reporting. With it, organizations can demonstrate regulators that third-party relationships are governed and resilient. Incident integration strengthens trust by proving providers are not only reactive but cooperative, ensuring shared responsibility extends into crisis scenarios where stakes are highest. Access recertification prevents vendor privileges from persisting unnecessarily. Periodically, organizations must review vendor accounts, roles, and tokens to confirm they remain necessary. For example, if a support engineer's account has not been used in 6 months, it should be revoked. Recertification is like checking guest passes. Visitors must renew permissions or access lapses automatically. In cloud, automated recertification workflows compare current access against justification, reducing risk of forgotten accounts. Regulators expect evidence of periodic reviews, particularly for privileged vendor accounts. Without recertification, dormant credentials may become attack vectors, undermining least privilege principles. By embedding recertification into governance cycles, organizations show that vendor access is not permanent but conditional, reinforcing accountability and minimizing exposure. Termination and offboarding procedures define how vendor access and dependencies are unwound at contract end. These procedures revoke accounts, retrieve data, confirm deletion, and document outcomes. For example, a DPA may require providers to issue certificates of destruction within 30 days. Offboarding is like returning keys after moving out. It prevents lingering access or forgotten obligations. Without structured offboarding, vendors may retain credentials, data, or residual influence over systems, creating hidden risks. Procedures also ensure business continuity by transferring services or data to replacement providers smoothly. Offboarding closes the vendor lifecycle responsibly, demonstrating governance maturity. It proves that risk management extends not only to onboarding and monitoring, but also to termination, reducing exposure at the end of relationships. Risk acceptance registers document residual risks that remain after due diligence and monitoring. Each entry includes a description, compensating controls, acceptance date, and executive approval. For example, if a vendor lacks ASOC2 report but provides limited evidence, leadership may formally accept the risk with conditions. Registers ensure risks are not ignored, but acknowledged, tracked, and revisited. This is like signing waivers for hazardous activities. Risks remain, but accountability is explicit. Regulators and auditors often request risk acceptance documentation to confirm governance. Without registers, organizations risk hidden liabilities or informal acceptance. By documenting residual risks transparently, governance becomes defensible, balancing practicality with diligence. It ensures executives, not individual analysts, make final calls on whether vendor risks remain tolerable within the organization's appetite. Metrics and dashboards provide real-time visibility into third-party risk posture. Dashboards may display open risks, assessment aging, remediation progress, and dependency maps. For example, a chart may highlight vendors with overdue attestations or open high-severity findings. Metrics transform governance from reactive reporting into proactive management. They are like cockpit instruments. Leaders see altitude, speed, and warnings at a glance. Dashboards also support board reporting, translating complex vendor ecosystems into understandable trends. Without metrics, organizations rely on anecdotes, which weaken accountability. With them, leaders can prioritize resources, track progress, and demonstrate compliance. Dashboards ensure that third-party risk management is not a black box, but a transparent, measurable discipline supporting strategic decisions. Anti-patterns reveal practices that undermine third-party governance. One common anti-pattern is relying solely on one-time questionnaires without validating responses. Another is granting vendors perpetual access without periodic reviews. These shortcuts provide an illusion of oversight but collapse under scrutiny. They are like inspecting a building once and assuming it will remain safe forever. Courts and regulators increasingly penalize checkbox compliance, demanding evidence of continuous diligence. Anti-patterns highlight immaturity, showing that governance was not integrated into culture. By recognizing these pitfalls, organizations can course-correct, embedding practices like validation, monitoring, and recertification. Avoiding anti-patterns is as important as following best practices, ensuring third-party governance remains credible and effective. Documentation packages preserve contracts, assessments, exceptions, and monitoring results for audits and regulators. These packages create defensibility, showing that vendor governance was systematic, transparent, and evidence-based. For example, an auditor may request proof that breach notification clauses exist and were tested. Packages also support incident response, providing immediate access to vendor contacts and obligations. Documentation is like keeping maintenance records for vehicles. It proves diligence and prevents disputes. Without it, organizations may struggle to defend their practices, even if they acted responsibly. Documentation packages close the loop, ensuring oversight is not only performed but provable. They demonstrate maturity, giving regulators, customers, and boards confidence that vendor risk management is embedded into operations and auditable at any time. From an exam perspective, candidates must understand how due diligence artifacts and monitoring signals map to vendor criticality and control assurance. Questions may ask which tools apply to Tier 1 versus Tier 3 vendors, or how to respond when provider attestations expire. Exam relevance emphasizes reasoning, why independent assurance complements questionnaires, how continuous monitoring detects posture drift, and which anti-patterns erode credibility. Success requires connecting legal, technical, and governance elements into a coherent lifecycle of third-party oversight. Exam readiness here mirrors professional practice, demonstrating the ability to evaluate providers holistically and ensure risk remains within tolerance. By mastering these concepts, candidates prove they can transform abstract risk frameworks into concrete practices that sustain trust in cloud ecosystems. In conclusion, structured due diligence, contractual controls, and continuous monitoring keep third-party risk visible and manageable. Inventories, criticality tiers, and questionnaires establish baselines, while certifications, technical testing, and privacy reviews provide evidence. Contracts embed obligations, financial checks ensure viability, and concentration analysis prevents over-reliance. Continuous monitoring, attack surface reviews, and SLA tracking keep posture current, while recertification, offboarding, and risk registers close the lifecycle responsibly. Avoiding anti-patterns and preserving documentation ensures governance remains defensible under audit. Together, these practices align external provider risk with organizational appetite, proving that dependencies can be trusted. Third-party risk management is not a barrier to cloud adoption but an enabler of safe, resilient, and compliant operations across dynamic ecosystems. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.